Some people think they can say whatever they want until they learn the hard way. A cozy yet modern atmosphere with dim lighting casting a warm glow over polished wooden tables. Framed black and white photos of jazz legends line the walls. The hum of conversation and clinking silverware blend seamlessly with the smooth sounds of a saxophone floating through the air. The rich aroma of Cajun catfish, buttery cornbread, and slow-cooked collard greens fills the space, wrapping around guests like a welcoming embrace. James Carter stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, focused as he added the finishing touches to a plate of braised short ribs. His restaurant, Carter's Southern Table, was packed tonight. A full house of guests savoring the fusion of soul food and fine dining he had spent years perfecting. He glanced at the line of dishes waiting to be sent out, nodding in satisfaction. This was what he lived for. Outside, the door swung open, and in walked Karen Reynolds, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp features and a rigid posture. She clutched her designer purse like it might be snatched at any moment, her nose twitching at the scent of smoked spices in the air. Beside her was Linda Thompson, a longtime friend who often found herself caught between Karen's sharp tongue and polite society. Karen barely stepped 2 feet inside before wrinkling her nose. Too loud, too crowded, too much seasoning in the air. She exhaled sharply, glancing around at the predominantly black staff and customers. She leaned toward Linda, her voice just low enough to feign discretion. Typical. They always overseason everything. Linda sighed, already regretting agreeing to dinner. A hostess greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome to Carter's Southern Table. Do you have a reservation?" Karen barely looked at her. "Obviously. Karen Reynolds, 8 o'clock. The hostess scanned the list and nodded. "Right this way." As they weaved through the tables, Karen's eyes darted around, inspecting every detail. She had heard about this place from a coworker who raved about the food, but Karen hadn't expected this. The decor was elegant, sure, but there was an unmistakable soulfulness to it, something that didn't quite fit into the pristine, sterile restaurants she preferred. Once seated, Karen barely touched the menu before letting out a dramatic sigh. "It's so overwhelming in here." Linda raised a brow. "Overwhelming?" Karen gestured vaguely. "The smell, the noise. I prefer places with a little more refinement." Linda didn't respond, choosing instead to glance around at the lively, happy guests. Whatever Karen's problem was, she wasn't going to entertain it. A young waitress approached, her name tag reading Maya. Her bright smile was warm and professional. "Good evening, ladies. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Karen barely acknowledged her. "Just water." "No lemon." Maya nodded, turning to Linda, who smiled. "I'll have a glass of Chardonnay, please." "Absolutely," Maya said before pulling out her notepad. "And have you had a chance to look over the menu?" Karen exhaled dramatically, flipping the menu shut. "I'll have the grilled salmon, steamed asparagus, and a side salad. But, and this is very important, I don't want it drowned in butter and salt. Keep the seasoning light. Some of us actually care about our health." Linda's smile faltered. Maya's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. "Of course, ma'am. Our chef prepares everything fresh, so I'll be sure to pass along your request." Karen pursed her lips. "See that you do." Maya nodded politely and left. Linda cleared her throat. "You know, you could have been a little nicer." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "I just want my food done properly. These places always overdo it. It's like they don't understand subtlety." Linda sighed, choosing to stay quiet. 15 minutes later, the food arrived. Maya set Karen's plate down with practiced grace. "Grilled salmon with steamed asparagus and a fresh garden salad. Enjoy." Karen barely muttered a thank you before picking up her fork. She cut into the salmon, lifting a piece to her mouth. The moment it touched her tongue, her face twisted in displeasure. "Ugh!" She dropped her fork with a loud clatter, making heads turn. Linda frowned. What's wrong? Karen grabbed her napkin and dabbed at her lips like she had been poisoned. It's awful. Linda blinked. It looks fine. Karen shoved the plate away. It's not. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They just can't help themselves. Probably dumped a whole jar of seasoning on it. Linda hesitated. Did you even taste it properly? Karen scoffed. I know bad food when I taste it, Linda. She turned, snapping her fingers at Maya, who was serving another table. Excuse me! Maya hurried over, her professional mask firmly in place. Is everything okay? Karen let out a huff. Does this look okay? I asked for light seasoning. This is still over-seasoned, and frankly, it's inedible. Maya's expression remained even. I'm sorry to hear that. Would you like us to remake it? Karen shook her head. No, I want to speak to the chef. I need to see who thought this was acceptable. Maya hesitated. Are you sure? I'd be happy to... Karen's voice cut through the restaurant. I said, I want the chef. A hush fell over the surrounding tables. A few guests exchanged looks, sensing the tension rising. Linda closed her eyes briefly, knowing this was about to escalate. Maya nodded stiffly. One moment, ma'am. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging doors. Behind the counter, James was plating a final dish when he saw Maya approach, her posture a little stiffer than usual. He raised a brow. What's up? Maya sighed, lowering her voice. Table 7, the woman in the gray blazer. She's demanding to see the chef. James wiped his hands on a towel, already guessing the type of customer he was about to deal with. What's the issue? Maya gave him a knowing look. She claims her salmon is over-seasoned, even though we barely put anything on it. James inhaled through his nose, exhaling slowly. This wasn't the first difficult customer he'd dealt with, and it wouldn't be the last. All right, he said, tossing the towel over his shoulder. Let's see what she has to say. He pushed through the kitchen doors, walking out into the dining area. As he approached table 7, Karen's expression twisted in expectation. The tension in Carter's southern table thickened like a slow-simmered gumbo. Conversations quieted, silverware clinked less frequently, and subtle glances darted toward table 7, where Karen sat with an air of entitlement, her fingers tapping impatiently against the white tablecloth. James Carter stood at her side, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had dealt with difficult customers before, every chef had, but something about the way Karen spoke, the way she dismissed his restaurant before even giving it a real chance, stirred something deeper in him. I understand there's an issue with your meal? His voice was level, professional, but there was a steeliness beneath it. Karen exhaled sharply, lifting her fork with 2 fingers like it was contaminated. Issue? This is inedible. She shoved the plate forward, the silverware rattling against porcelain. I asked for light seasoning, not whatever heavy-handed mess this is. James didn't blink. I assure you, ma'am, our dishes are prepared with fresh ingredients and balanced flavors. Karen scoffed. Balanced? This is balanced? She poked at the salmon like it had personally offended her. Who taught you how to cook? Is this even your recipe? Or did you just copy it off the internet? A murmur spread through the surrounding tables. Linda, who had been quiet up until now, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Karen? Karen ignored her, leaning in as if she were letting James in on some inside knowledge. Listen, I know how these kitchens work. You're probably just following some corporate recipe, right? A little pre-measured seasoning, a squeeze of lemon, and voila, out it goes. If I wanted real food, I'd go to a place where the chefs actually know what they're doing. Linda sucked in a sharp breath. A couple sitting nearby shook their heads, one of them whispering, "She did not just say that." James didn't flinch, though something flickered in his eyes. He had spent years crafting this menu, testing, tweaking, perfecting each dish. Every recipe came from his grandmother's kitchen, the kind of food that had soul, history, and pride. To hear it dismissed like some fast food chain's prepackaged meal was a different kind of insult. "Karen?" Linda cut in, voice tight. "Maybe it's just not your taste." Karen waved her off. "No, I want to speak to the owner. I'm sure he wouldn't allow this kind of subpar food to be served." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. James smirked, arms still crossed. "Ma'am," he said, slow and measured, "I am the owner." Karen's lips parted. She blinked once, twice. "You?" "That's right." James nodded, never breaking eye contact. "I built this place from the ground up. Every dish is my recipe, perfected over years." Karen's face turned a shade darker. She fumbled, reaching for her water glass as if it might cool the heat rising up her neck. She took a sip, swallowed hard, and set the glass down with a clink. "Well," she stammered, "that doesn't change the fact that this food is terrible." A guest, 2 tables over, pulled out their phone, subtly angling the camera toward the scene. Another table exchanged knowing glances, shaking their heads. James remained composed, but the weight of the moment pressed against him. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let someone like Karen disrespect what he had built. "I respect your opinion, ma'am," he said, voice steady, "but I stand by my food. It's been praised by top critics and, more importantly, by the people in this city who actually appreciate quality soul food." Karen's jaw tightened. She was losing control of the conversation, and she knew it. She sniffed, eyes flicking around the restaurant. "You know what?" she said, forcing a laugh. "This place isn't as high-end as you think it is. No wonder the food is mediocre." A heavy silence followed. James raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this restaurant was featured in Atlanta Eats last month. We also have a 5-star rating from hundreds of customers." Karen's smugness flickered. She grabbed her purse. "Well, I won't be back." James shrugged. "That's your choice, but I'd appreciate it if you treated my staff with respect before you leave." Karen's mouth opened, then shut. She turned on her heel, shoulders stiff, and strode toward the exit. Linda hesitated for half a second before rising and following her. As the door swung shut behind them, the restaurant exhaled as one. Then, man, that was wild. A ripple of low chuckles spread through the tables. A few guests clapped lightly, nodding toward James in support. Maya, the waitress, returned with a satisfied grin. "You handled that way better than I would have," she muttered under her breath. James finally allowed himself to breathe. He glanced toward the plate Karen had abandoned. The salmon, perfectly cooked, flaked slightly where she had stabbed it with her fork. She barely tasted it. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Some people," Maya added, "walk into places like this already deciding they're not going to like it." James nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "But she didn't just come for the food." Maya's brow furrowed. James looked toward the door where Karen had left, something unreadable passing over his face. "This wasn't about seasoning," he said quietly. "This was about something else." Maya followed his gaze, her expression shifting in realization. Outside, Karen yanked open the door to her car and slid into the driver's seat, slamming it shut. Her hands gripped the wheel too tightly. Linda sat beside her, watching her carefully. Karen's jaw clenched. Her breath was uneven, her cheeks still flushed. "Are you okay?" Linda asked. Karen didn't answer. She exhaled sharply, staring out the windshield. And then, so softly Linda almost missed it, Karen muttered, "I just don't like being wrong." Linda said nothing. She just sat there, watching as Karen put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving behind the restaurant, the meal, and the truth she wasn't ready to face. After the humiliating encounter at Carter's southern table, Karen couldn't shake the sting of embarrassment. She had stormed out that evening, her face burning with rage and indignation, vowing never to step foot in that overrated place again. But the experience lingered. For days she replayed the moment in her head, the laughter from the other diners, the way James Carter had coolly revealed himself as the owner, the way her insults had backfired so spectacularly. Her friend Linda had found the entire thing hilarious, teasing her relentlessly. "You have to admit," Linda had said over coffee the next morning, barely suppressing a grin. That was karma in real time. Karen had scoffed. Please, that place wasn't even that special, just another trendy spot that people overhype. Linda had raised an eyebrow. Oh? Is that why you were raving about the mac and cheese before you found out who made it? Karen had gone silent. The truth was, she had loved the food, but admitting that felt like surrender. Still, she refused to let one bad night ruin her reputation as a woman of high standards. So, when Linda suggested dinner at Le Jardin, an upscale French bistro across town, Karen leaped at the chance. It was the perfect way to erase the memory of that awful night. No more small-time chefs with attitudes, no more surprises, just an elegant evening in a real fine dining establishment. Or so she thought. 1 week later, the air in Le Jardin was thick with the scent of butter, fresh herbs, and slow-braised meats. The restaurant was an upscale French bistro nestled in the heart of downtown Atlanta, where polished marble floors gleamed under soft candlelight, and the gentle hum of live jazz filled the air. Karen adjusted the pearl bracelet on her wrist, smoothing a hand over the sleeve of her navy blue blazer. She had chosen this restaurant, La Belle Maison, specifically because of its reputation, exclusive, sophisticated, a place where only the finest chefs cooked for the city's elite. This was where she could finally erase the memory of that disastrous experience at Carter's Southern table the week before. Across from her, Linda glanced around the restaurant with mild awe. "This place is stunning," she murmured, running a fingertip over the embossed gold lettering on the menu. "I can see why you were so eager to come here." Karen lifted her wine glass, taking a slow sip of Bordeaux before offering a pleased nod. "I needed this," she admitted. "After last week? I deserve a proper meal. No over-seasoned, second-rate nonsense, just classic, expertly prepared cuisine." Linda simply hummed, her expression unreadable. A polished waiter in a crisp black suit approached, his hands neatly clasped in front of him. "Bonsoir, mesdames. May I introduce tonight's featured guest chef?" Karen barely looked up from the menu. "Oh, I don't really—" "And tonight we have the honor of welcoming the brilliant chef James Carter, who will be personally overseeing the kitchen and preparing some of his finest dishes." Karen's fingers stiffened around the stem of her wine glass. Her stomach lurched. She slowly lifted her gaze, heart hammering against her ribs, as if she had misheard. The waiter continued, unaware of the sudden chill that settled over table 5. "Chef Carter has prepared an exquisite selection for tonight's tasting menu, blending classic French techniques with a modern flair. I highly recommend the—" Karen cleared her throat sharply. "Excuse me, did you say James Carter?" The waiter smiled. "Yes, madam, one of the most celebrated chefs in the city, a truly inspired talent." Linda let out a soft, almost delighted chuckle, glancing at Karen over the rim of her wineglass. "Karen," she mused, voice laced with amusement, "looks like you're eating his food after all." Karen's breath grew shallow. She forced a tight smile, the skin around her lips straining. "Well," she said, voice clipped, "I suppose we'll see if he actually knows how to cook French cuisine." Linda smirked but said nothing. Karen straightened in her seat, regaining composure. This wasn't Carter's Southern table. This was an upscale establishment, a real restaurant. There was no way James Carter, of all people, could pull off refined, intricate French dishes. Soul food? Fine. But classical French gastronomy? Impossible. She squared her shoulders as the waiter placed a menu in front of her. The words blurred slightly, but she forced herself to focus. Tasting menu, hand-selected by Chef Carter. Her nails dug into the soft leather cover. The thought of eating his food, praising his skills after the way she had humiliated herself at his restaurant, left a sour taste in her mouth. But she had no choice now. She couldn't storm out. That would be too obvious, too embarrassing. She would simply endure the meal, keep her thoughts to herself, and leave. A few minutes later, the first course arrived. A delicate amuse-bouche, a single, artfully plated bite that looked almost too perfect to touch. A miniature puff pastry filled with creamy truffle mousse, topped with a delicate sliver of black truffle and a whisper of chive oil. Karen stared at it for a beat too long. Linda, watching closely, picked up her fork, took a bite, and closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, a knowing smile played on her lips. "Oh, wow," she said, setting her fork down gently. "That's incredible." Karen hesitated, then reluctantly lifted her fork, cutting into the pastry. She brought the bite to her lips, fully prepared to hate it. But then, the moment the flavors hit her tongue, her breath caught. The pastry was impossibly light, buttery, shattering at the slightest pressure. The filling, earthy, rich, perfectly balanced, melted against her palate. The truffle, usually overpowering, was subtle, enhancing rather than overwhelming. Her throat tightened. She swallowed hard, struggling to suppress her expression, but the corners of her mouth twitched involuntarily. Linda's smirk deepened. "It's good, isn't it?" Karen set her fork down a little too quickly. "It's fine," she muttered. Linda let out a small, amused breath, but didn't push further. The next course arrived, a seared scallop resting atop a velvety saffron-infused beurre blanc, paired with a crisp apple and fennel salad. The contrast of textures, the delicate balance of acid and butter, it was flawless. Then came the duck confit, cooked to absolute perfection, its skin crackling at the slightest touch, the meat tender enough to melt apart with a gentle pull of the fork. Each bite was a betrayal. With every dish that arrived, Karen found herself sinking deeper into silent resentment, because no matter how much she wanted to deny it, this was some of the best food she had ever eaten. The restaurant buzzed with quiet admiration, tables murmuring their approval. And then, a familiar voice. James Carter emerged from the open kitchen, greeting a table of VIP guests near the front. His chef's jacket was immaculate, sleeves neatly rolled up, his presence confident but effortless. The same hands that had cooked soul food from his grandmother's recipes were now commanding a kitchen that served Michelin-level dishes. Karen stiffened. She wanted to believe he hadn't noticed her. But as he turned, his sharp gaze swept across the dining room, and, for the briefest second, his eyes landed on hers. A knowing smirk played at the corner of his lips. Karen's throat went dry. He didn't approach. He didn't say a word. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back toward the kitchen. The message was clear. Karen sat frozen, staring at the last few bites on her plate. She swallowed not just the food, but the weight of her own pride. This wasn't Carter's southern table. This wasn't her moment to control. Here, in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, James Carter's talent spoke for itself, and there was nothing she could say to change that. Linda leaned in slightly, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Well," she murmured, spearing the last bite of her duck, "I think that's what they call karma." Karen, stiff and silent, said nothing. She simply picked up her wine glass and took a long, slow sip, swallowing her pride with every drop. Respect isn't just about words, it's about recognizing people's worth. James didn't just prove Karen wrong, he reminded everyone watching that talent, dignity, and hard work will always outshine ignorance. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment like this? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories.